Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Patrick Duddy. I'm the director of Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Today's program is sponsored by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, along with the Duke Center for International and Global Studies. Our guest today is Cynthia Arnson. She is the director of the Latin America program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I know many of you will have seen her resume and you know her work. She is one of the most respected scholars of Latin America in the United States, and she directs one of the premier think tank programs which regularly examines developments within the region. Her list of publications, professional associations is long, and I won't attempt to recapitulate them all now. But it seems to me that there are few people in the United States more qualified to address today's topic than Cynthia Arnson. And today's topic is Latin American politics in the age of COVID. Cindy, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know that you are astonishingly busy in Washington and with the center, and we are very grateful that you have found time for us today. With that very short preamble, I would like to invite you to please make any opening remarks that you would care to share with us to get us started. And to our audience, let me remind you that we will reserve the final 20 minutes or so of our 1-hour program today for questions from the audience. Please submit your questions to the Q&A function, and we will together get to as many of them as we possibly can. So without further ado, Cynthia Arnson.
Great. Thanks, Ambassador Duddy, for this kind invitation. Thanks, Dr. Rojas, for your help with today's webinar. It would be really great to be doing this in person. In fact, I was supposed to come to Duke last year, and it was called off at the last minute, really. I think I was due to come, Patrick, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in the second half of March of 2020. What a world we have all inhabited, in this time. I know the quality of the Duke student body and of its faculty, and so I'll keep my opening remarks brief and hope to take as many great questions that we can pack into this hour. Let me start by stating the obvious. Latin America has suffered greatly during the pandemic. It is the region of the world with the highest mortality rates of any region in the entire world, including in the developing world. Brazil, which, as we know, is an epicenter of contagion and infection right now, accounts for about 1 out of every 4, if not 1 out of every 3 COVID deaths in the entire world at this moment. Countries have gone on repeated cycles of lockdown, even though certain countries such as Chile have been able to access vaccines. The overall rate of vaccination is low. It's about 2, maybe 3% of the population on average, with Chile, of course, having done much better and being one of the global leaders in vaccinating its population. If COVID has taken an enormous toll on the United States, Western European countries, it has had a devastating toll economically in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is the region, again, of the world with the dubious distinction of having seen the greatest economic contraction last year as a result of COVID, a regional average of between 7 and 8%, depending on whose figures you look at. That figure, I think, of about 7.7 is from the International Monetary Fund. And while the World Bank and others are predicting a return to growth, something like 4% this year. We're talking about 4% once there has been a decline of, say, 11, 12% in the case of Peru, 6 or 7% in the case of Colombia, with mixtures in between Mexico, Brazil, Chile. I mean, all having taken these enormous hits. So the real question is, why has that been the case? Why has Latin America, been sort of a world leader in these negative consequences? One has to do with the high rate of urbanization. Latin America is the most highly urbanized region of the entire world. There have been, enormous migrations out of rural areas over the last several decades. Not just the high concentration in urban centers, but also the high concentration of poor people in urban areas,
Right.
In slums, where the possibility for social distancing is pretty much non-existent. It's also a region where there are high levels of informality. On average, over 50% of the region's labor force is in the informal sector, and it's much higher in countries such as Peru, which has a high contagion rate, but also a level of informality of about 70%. Bolivia, 80%. Central America, Haiti, some countries even far above that. It's a region that has seen, and I'm sure given Ambassador Duddy's interests and own diplomatic background, we'll talk about a lot about Venezuela. It's also a region that has absorbed between 4 and 5 million Venezuelan refugees in a very short period of time, since really about 2014. The bulk of them, the official count, 1.8 million. In Colombia, Peru with about 1 million, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, Mexico, Costa Rica. There's really hardly a country that has escaped this large influx of Venezuelan migrants. So that is also an additional strain on regional economies. And that'll be my segue into talking about the state of politics in the region. One can imagine that it is extremely roiled at a time of these broad economic contractions, the number of deaths, the number of infections, the collapse of the health sector in a place like Brazil, which had a very robust public health system, which is now just simply overwhelmed. And I think in order to really understand the impact on politics, we have to wind the clock back several years to the pre-COVID time. If you remember, in late 2019, this was a time, beginning in like October in Chile and Peru and Colombia and Ecuador. This was a time of great popular protest against incumbent regimes. And the issues at the time were inequality, the poor quality of the public health or public education systems, the growing sort of disaffection with democracy overall. We've seen, whether you use the figures from the Americas Barometer of LAPOP or Latino Barometro from Chile, declining levels of support for democracy overall, a lack of faith in democratic systems, a lack of representativity of political parties, growing gaps between political leaders, the elected political leaders, and society at large. Not yet a sense, as one had in Argentina in the early 2000s, of que se vayan todos, let them all, get out of the way. But still, this growing gap, a lack of trust. Anyway, all of the indicators on democratic governance were not looking good. And coming out of that protest movement, there were some important institutional reforms. We're seeing that, before our very eyes in Chile, a process of constitutional reform. Unfortunately, the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which were to take place this Sunday on April 11th, have now been postponed until the middle of May because of this new outbreak of new strains of COVID. But Peru, Ecuador will be having elections. Ecuador for the second round, Peru in the first round. And what you see, I think, all over the region is a level of fragmentation, of polarization, and of dissatisfaction with government leaders. And I think that, you know, for a long time in the United States, there was the sense, you know, it's the economy stupid. It's not only going to be the economy, it's going to be the perceived capacity of government leaders, you know, to deal with the crisis in a way that seems fair and that is done without corruption. And, you know, if corruption was, again, one of the big issues that emerged in the region around 2016, 2017, with this huge Odebrecht construction scandal in 10 or 12 countries of the region, from the Brazil construction giant Odebrecht, there was a sense that the region was responding in positive ways and implementing changes that were going to provide for greater accountability. And we've seen a lot of that just completely undone. You know, the removal of the UN-sponsored body in Guatemala, the CICIG, the dismissal of the people responsible for the investigation of Odebrecht and the so-called car wash scandal. And sadly, I mean, you know, there's a way in which people say that crises bring out the best in people and they also bring out the worst. Well, it's brought out the worst. I mean, there's hardly a country that has escaped, you know, some scandal related to COVID, whether it's the overpricing of PPE or even of coffins in Ecuador, and the number of health ministers that have been forced to resign as a result of these scandals, most recently over, you know, privileged access by politicians, family members, well-connected individuals to vaccines long before they were available to the general population. So if I had to sum up the mood, I mean, I'm not sure that there's any new, real good polling data, you know, during lockdowns, but I think that, you know, some leaders have benefited from a bump, you know, in public opinion evaluations, because they're seen as having responded in a responsible and proactive way. You've seen that for Francisco Sagasti in Peru, who unfortunately is not running, and the field is fragmented between, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 17 candidates, with no one with over about 12 or 13%. And the elections are happening this Sunday. So there's fragmentation, there's polarization, there's renewed polarization in Brazil over, you know, the just kind of rampant, you know, COVID rates of infection, the denials and the lack of effective response of Bolsonaro. And the vacating of the prohibition on Lula to participate, you know, in next year's elections. So all of this is happening as the region is going through yet another, you know, so-called super cycle of elections. You know, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, presidential elections, Nicaragua, Honduras at the end of the year, Colombia, Brazil. Next year, midterm elections in Argentina and in Mexico. I mean, there will be lots of opportunities to gauge the sense of where the population is. And I think that, like a lot of people, there's a fear that that this will favor not necessarily candidates of the left or the right, but of populists, of people who promise to respond to the economic suffering that people have gone through, regardless of whether the resources are there to sustain it. And there's also been, and we see this clearly in the Peruvian case, an outbreak anti-migrant sentiment, anti-Venezuelan sentiment that's being used, in politically expedient ways, as we've seen, in our own country, how easy it is to whip up anti-migrant sentiment when
Sure.
people themselves are feeling squeezed. So I'll stop there. It's not a pretty picture. It's there's many other aspects that are very, very grim. The number of students that are, not only not in school, but not having had access to remote education. The number of people who may never go back to school as a result of COVID, the loss of educational opportunities, for vast numbers of people. So anyway, it's a challenging moment.
Well, I have to say that was pretty grim.
Totally. I wish
Pretty
there were
grim.
little, rays of light or even points of light. I mean, I think there are some, but overall, at the macro level, the region is not doing well.
Right.
Yep.
And I concur. What I'd like to do, if I may, open with a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
And I'd like to some degree to go country by country. But before we do, I'd like to endorse, to double down on your comments about the informality in any number of important economies in the region, because I suspect that what it means for Peru, what it means for Ecuador, what it means for Bolivia, is that the real impact of COVID is even worse than the various international agencies have so far been able to document. The last numbers I saw on Peru suggested that the economy contracted 11.1% last year. And that's, if you will, a fairly rosy assessment, since they were actually down 30 or 40% at one point earlier in the year. Mm-hmm. But my guess is that most of the organizations compiling these numbers are unable to really capture the impact of COVID on the informal sector. Now, that said, to start in Peru, where, as you know, President Sagasti is not running, and I recall vividly some of the questions that that you threw his way only a few weeks ago in a Wilson Center webinar. The question I have is, given the difficulties there, the extraordinary range of candidates, and the fact, as President Sagasti emphasized, that virtually every living Peruvian ex-president has either been, is being investigated, is on trial, or has been found guilty in one way or another of some form of official malfeasance. How prominently is COVID playing in your, and from your point of view, in this election? What does it count?
Wow.
You know what I mean?
I hear what you're saying. I think it does. It certainly counts, because people have suffered the effects of this economic contraction so dramatically. And even though Peru, well, let's make that just a declarative sentence. Peru adopted a kind of social policy response because of the fiscal cushion that it had, given high prices for copper and its role as the number 2 copper producer in the world, and really kind of responded in a very expansionist way to the deprivations of COVID. And even despite that, it was one of the first countries to lock down entirely, to close borders. And even despite that, it's not doing well, and it's suffering these waves. I do think it has to do with the informality. which is also linked to inequality, another
Sure.
word that one
And poverty.
associates with the region. I wish I had this at my fingertips, but I remember reading at one point, at some point last year, early on in the pandemic, the number of households in Peru that had a refrigerator and the percentage that did not gave you such a graphic sense of why people had to go out every day, to get food. Now, you're asking me, what does this mean for the election? I think people are fed up with politicians. I think that Peru for a long time has had a very weak, party system. The political parties have been sort of created around individuals. One of the leading candidates at one point was the, former star of a soccer club. That people will gravitate ultimately in the second round toward the person who seems the most likely to offer redress for people's pocketbooks. And in that sense, I think COVID has played a role. And it's also played a role in deepening the disgust, of people. When you have someone like Martin Vizcarra, who was in office, was impeached by a Congress that most Peruvians viewed as deeply corrupt, and I think with good reason. Even he was implicated in this, vacuna gate, the vaccine gate, by which well-connected politicians were able to get access to the vaccine. So I think the level of disgust is very high. It'll be interesting to see what the abstention rates are. And some of the abstention could be related to COVID. I mean, there have been elections last year that took place under COVID, in Dominican Republic, but Dominican Republic saw an increase in COVID cases,
Right.
After people stood in line. So, the levels of participation could reflect multiple things: fear of going to the polls, but also just overall disgust.
Let me invite you to think about a country a little closer to home. You didn't mention Mexico in your opening remarks. Commentaries that I've read recently suggest that as bad as we may well have thought the situation was in Mexico, it's actually worse than that. And indeed, the death toll, not just in relative terms, but conceivably, even in absolute terms, may well be as high as in Brazil. Do you have a sense of how Mexico is handling the pandemic and what the consequences may be either for López Obrador or others if they are not able to bring the contagion under control?
Yeah. Mexico, AMLO has also, as he's known, López Obrador by his initials, AMLO has also responded in grievously insufficient and borderline irresponsible ways by denying the severity of the pandemic, by insisting that, the economic pain of lockdowns was greater than the pain of getting COVID. And the refusal to implement those kinds of public health measures early on, has really allowed the pandemic to expand. That said, López Obrador remains highly popular in the country. For any leader to have, over 50% at any time in history is a big deal. And it's because the majority of Mexicans, and I haven't seen, his ratings may have fallen below 50% recently, and I'm just unaware, but there's a sense that he has the interests of the average Mexican, front and center, whereas the the white elites that have, occupied the presidency in recent years have not. And that they can count on him to do the right thing. It's a very, anti-private sector discourse, which has a certain resonance, in the kind of populist playbook. Whether he will suffer long term, I don't know. I honestly don't know. But it does give me the opportunity to make a brief comment about U.S.-Mexican relations. I mean, there are many, many areas of friction between the United States and Mexico, not least of which on security cooperation and, the requirement that's been imposed that U.S. agencies, the DEA, others working on, drug trafficking and other organized crime cases have to share the names of informants and that kind of thing with their Mexican counterparts. I mean, that is just a non-starter, given the levels of high level corruption, that we've seen in Mexico in just the last couple of years. But there's a sense with with the Biden administration that there has to be an enormous effort to find areas of commonality with AMLO, because the migration issues, the USMCA trade integration issues are so fundamental to both countries that there has to be sort of every effort made to keep that relationship on a positive track. Mexico obviously plays a huge role as well in helping the United States detain Central American migration, which is, if it hasn't already is becoming, the first really major crisis that this administration is facing. So there's
I think it is the first major crisis.
Exactly. It is just really, don't rock the boat, look wherever you can, for commonalities, regardless of the frictions and the divergences in the way we view things.
Well, at the risk of seeming to look in a rather scattershot way at the region, I'd like to, go all the way south now to Argentina. And I note a couple of things. First, international media are reporting that notwithstanding the fact that President Fernandez has acknowledged he's presently suffering from COVID, and earlier took the Russian supplied vaccine, there are a number of key sort of issues that are out there. One is that the Argentine economy is really struggling, and Vice President Fernandez has actually said the country cannot meet its international obligations to the IMF again. Do you have a sense of the degree to which COVID has intensified the economic difficulties that Argentina is experiencing?
Well, there's no question that COVID has hit everybody hard. It's, decreased GDP all over. Argentina was going to struggle to repay, these billions of dollars in IMF, financing anyhow. But without an economy that's growing, it's very difficult. And it becomes a very polemical issue, as the IMF certainly is, in Argentina, going back to the crisis of like 2001, where the IMF, really, in my view, acted very irresponsibly. Just told Argentina to go to hell, and we don't care about the economic pain in the country. So it's a very convenient whipping boy or girl vis-a-vis Argentine public opinion. And when it comes to a hard choice with limited fiscal resources, to pay back, international bankers, let alone the IMF, versus, invest in education, that becomes a very, very difficult political issue. Now, the IMF in recent years, especially during the Macri administration, and seeing, where the electoral trends were going even before Fernandez was elected, was bending over backwards to make as easy as possible, the terms of repayment and just, keep Argentina from repudiating its debt and once again, locking itself out of international private capital markets. And, it took Macri, to kind of make peace with the bondholders and make it possible, for Argentina to once again, access foreign financing. But the level of debt at this point is very problematic. And, I'm not sure, what the answer is. Hopefully, there's so many dynamic sectors of the Argentine economy, so much innovation that takes place in Buenos Aires, so many sort of unicorns and stuff that come out of that, innovation ecosystem, that there is potential for growth. Also, as long as, drought and whatever doesn't put a serious damper on soy or beef exports, the Chinese economy is recovering fairly nicely, thank you very much. And, Argentine exports of soy and beef and whatever to the Chinese market could provide a little bit of a, of a cushion going forward. But this is a kind of a looming issue. And we'll have to see. I mean, Argentina has midterm elections later this year. And we'll see where that, where those coalitions shake down.
We will indeed. And I have been looking so far in vain for suggestions from other quarters on how Argentina, for instance, can address these increasingly urgent requirements. I haven't seen much from the IMF. Perhaps you have, but I certainly agree with your sense that it will be very, very hard to justify repaying international bankers if every important social sector of the country, already suffering, will be asked to suffer even more, to tighten belts even further. We haven't. There are a couple of or three other issues that we have not yet touched on. I think you summarized very nicely the situation in Brazil, but it's hard even to get beyond the numbers to look at the economy. But obviously, the economy in Brazil, while it may recover marginally this year, it will be recovering after years of recession, and so this does not augur particularly well, I would argue, for the Bolsonaro administration. Nevertheless, a very senior commentator who has also been a cabinet member in another government in the region commented to me the other day that he thought that the return of Lula, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil as a candidate, would not help Brazil emerge from this crisis. I was wondering if you have a different perspective on that.
Sure. Well, I think that the Bolsa, and the minute the Supreme Court sort of, retracted the conviction, thereby making him eligible to run, the stock markets plummeted, right. Again, not as if they had been doing so great, and, before that announcement, but this idea that Lula was going to return and that you'd have this kind of, in the view of the private sector, this sort of choose your poison, Bolsonaro or Lula, people were just kind of tearing their hair. That said, Lula was, quite apart from, it's hard to remove him or his presidency from the moment that Latin America was living in that first decade of the 2000s, which was the decade of the commodities boom, record amounts of poverty reduction, the expansion, huge expansion of Bolsa Familia that, reduced poverty levels in Brazil by sort of historic proportions.
And rapidly.
And very rapidly, and very rapidly, and it was, it was these cash payments in exchange, for keeping your kids in school and bringing them to the health clinics for vaccines. And, it wasn't just sort of like a free pass. There were real social gains. Now, how Lula would govern in a contracted economy like the one that he would inherit should he win the election next year is very very uncertain. How much he would balloon the levels of debt to keep social consumption at a decent level, expand unemployment insurance, all that kind of thing, the kinds of fiscal policies of a social welfare state. I think it's also important to point out that Lula and Michelle Bachelet and Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay were considered in that decade of the so-called, I hate the term pink tide, but of these leftist governments in Latin America as the moderate left, as the left that respected, the rules of the of capitalism, of the private sector, knew that it needed to keep levels of investment high, and not just, a policy of, restrict the private sector and tax the rich and go after them in the way that a number of his contemporaries, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and ni mucho menos, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, were doing, and with great levels of popularity. So, he does have a sense of what it takes to make market capitalism function. So,
I had the sense, well, I was there when Lula was elected the first time.
Yeah.
And knew any number of folks who were in senior positions in his government. And I remember vividly their contention, not just in public, but in private, that they did not they were not going to be dismantling all of the particularly successful institutions of the country. They didn't want that initial political victory to be a Pyrrhic victory.
Right.
And I, for all of the uncertainty that would accompany another Lula administration, I note that as a former labor leader, there has always been a very substantial practical dimension to his dialogue with the nation and his political outlook. Can we move, to what is for many people the most difficult problem in the region, and one obviously with which I, as a former ambassador in Venezuela, worked on for some time. How bad do you think in keeping within the parameters of this discussion, how bad do you think the corona pandemic is in Venezuela?
I think that the real answer to that is unknowable because of the utter lack of transparency. But based on what we do know about the collapse of the health sector prior to COVID, I think we have to assume that it's horrendous. This was a health sector that long before COVID, years before COVID, as a result of the economic or of the collapse of the economy, where hospitals, struggled to have soap or basic medicines, let alone running water and electricity. This is a humanitarian crisis that has been, many years in the making, and accounts for the number of people leaving the country. It is benefiting to a certain extent from, the Sputnik and the Chinese vaccines, but there's really no health infrastructure left, the number of doctors and nurses and qualified personnel that have left the country is enormous. And when you have, a country with such frequent blackouts, with, a system of potable water that's been in crisis for several years, one can only imagine, the worst. And it's, I think, emblematic of the government that Maduro himself, if not, his entire entourage, really holds the greatest degree of responsibility for the inability of the international community to come in with humanitarian relief, including food for people that are hungry and starving. And there was, maybe even 10 days ago, a great deal of hope that the opposition and Maduro and Pajo would kind of get together on a scheme by which the COVAX facility, the international facility, could distribute vaccines. That's fallen apart. And my impression, without knowing the details of the negotiation, is simply that Maduro was unwilling to cede any control over the distribution of those resources, which was a sine qua non for the opposition and for civil society.
I'm going to, with your permission, and I'm going to move now to some of the questions that are coming in from our viewers, our audience. I will return, though, in a few minutes with a couple of questions about U.S. policy, where we ought to be going, and also the importance of the inter-American system. For now, we got one very interesting question from I believe a Paraguayan who asked, is the fact that we have not mentioned Paraguay indicative more or less of the success Paraguay has had to date in dealing with the pandemic, or do you have a sense of that?
I would not be truthful if I told you that I knew a lot about Paraguay, but I think that you can hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. One, that the levels of infection in Paraguay, given its proximity to Brazil, and even, to Argentina, were way lower than what was happening in the rest of the region. But at the same time, you've seen demonstrations recently against the government because of the same kinds of scandals about the distribution of the vaccines that have afflicted other countries. And there's, a very, very low level of, vaccine acquisition. I've seen figures, if I'm not mistaken, 5,000 doses or whatever. I mean, Paraguay is really behind in terms of accessing the amount of vaccines that it needs to, to provide some protection for the population. But there was nonetheless this moment when Paraguay was in the news because people were protesting, the poor response of the government in this regard. So I think that's about what I can say.
We have another question, an interesting one, I think, from one of our a student here in the region who asks if you have any sense of how the Arce government in Bolivia is doing, particularly with respect to the pandemic. They've only obviously been in office, he and his colleagues, for a short time, but has there been any news from Bolivia in terms of how they're handling things?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can comment on the pandemic per se, but I think that polarization in Bolivia is deepening as opposed to getting less. Now, that is not exclusively the responsibility of the Arce government. It happened a lot, from the beginnings of the Mas government, you were either before, in favor of Evo or you were against him. And that was a very huge clash. It played out in the elections in which led to Evo Morales' leaving the country. Still a lot of controversy about how votes were counted and whether he had won and whether he had lost, and the kind of the validity of the count of the Electoral Council. You had an interim government, a right-wing interim government, led by Janine Áñez, who herself was a very polarizing figure and pursued a number of, a lot of harassment of former Mas people. And then you have an election where Luis Arce comes in sort of saying, I'm gonna try to diminish the level of social conflict. And in fact, he's contributed to it, taking Áñez prisoner. It's one thing to launch a prosecution on some violation of the law, but, it has a kind of revenge sort of aspect to it. There were regional elections recently, I think in March in Bolivia, right, where the Mas lost an important number of departmental, provincial capitals that it had expected to win. That has not kind of helped the situation. There are a couple of runoffs still to take place. But I would say that the levels of polarization that became so acute and violent, around the time of, I'm forgetting whether it was 2019 or 2020. I mean, it's all such a mush in my head, given COVID. But when Evo, was forced to flee the country, right, the levels of polarization that sort of episode, those elections represented, and then the subsequent, interim presidency and the subsequent elections, it's not gone away. And Arce does not seem to be doing very much to diminish, the levels of polarization, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I have a couple of quick questions. Another economic question. One of our viewers writes that while the overall macroeconomic situation appears grim, are there any either countries or sectors you would expect to see thriving in the current environment?
Right. Nobody's really thriving, and no one's going to thrive until the pandemic is much more sort of under control. But where I see enormous opportunity for U.S. Latin American relations is in the green energy transition. And it's not so much in the United States, bound up in this huge infrastructure package where you're trying to wean the US economy from its heavy dependence on hydrocarbons and beef up solar, whatever. It's not quite as much a mirror of that, because you have certain countries, like Chile and Uruguay, that have already transformed, their energy matrices, right, in very impressive ways. I mean, Chile that, was dependent on Argentine gas and dependent on international markets for 100% of its imported petroleum, now has, I don't know what percentage of its electricity generation comes from solar, but it's huge. It's just huge. There's this new potential in green hydrogen. And so I think that the people who can look at that sector and take advantage of the interest in the United States in fostering that kind of growth and capacity will put themselves, ahead of the pack. Uruguay is a small country, but I see, Uruguay in a position to do well. The other sectors that have done very well, thank you very much, are the e-commerce ones, just as they have in the United States. I mean, Mercado Libre is opening, is expanding its networks all through Latin America. The gig economy as it has in the United States, not so much Uber, but all the food delivery services,
Right.
have expanded. Whether these constitute good jobs, I'm not in a position to say, and you can argue that square around, but there are sectors that have done well. And, as the US economy recovers, US demand, recovers, imports recover, as the Chinese economy recovers, you will see, an expansion of demand, unfortunately, for the same commodities that Latin America has always exported. But, hopefully people will be a little bit more imaginative and see kind of in the, who was it, Winston Churchill, that said, you should never lose the opportunity to capitalize on a good crisis, or, something along those lines.
Right?
Exactly. And, people who are thinking in those terms, how to help small and medium-sized businesses, how to expand the digitalization, how to expand access to internet. One of the great sort of social gaps that's been revealed, put in sharp relief by the pandemic, who can telework, who can't, who can have access to remote education, who can't, people who can start addressing, there's a great word in Spanish, brechas, these
Brechas,
enormous, chasms, gaps, will set themselves up, in the future for a much better quality growth, not just growth, but better quality growth.
There's an international geopolitical dimension to all of this, as any number of commentators have emphasized, that where, particularly before the Biden administration was inaugurated, that Russia and China would certainly attempt to take advantage of the crisis to improve their standing within the region. Do you think there's any chance that the EU, US, China, Russia, some combination of these major economies will be able to work together to address the humanitarian dimensions of the pandemic?
I don't see that. I see that Russia and China have benefited tremendously from the so-called, mask diplomacy, now vaccine diplomacy. The number of doses, may not be that impressive in terms of, the size of the population relative to what's available. But, the Russians have been all over. The Sputnik vaccine is a fraction of the cost of the vaccines from the, Western countries. The negotiations with US private companies have been onerous for developing countries, being forced to sign contracts about, that deny any liability for the company, for adverse outcomes, in the region. I mean, just really, really difficult things. Whereas Chile, Peru, participated with Chinese companies, with Sinopharm and Sinovac in these clinical trials. They have most of the Chilean vaccine. I mean, Chile's done better than anyone, but a lot of the story of that, are the vaccines from China. So both China and Russia have creatively used proactive presence in Latin America as a way of expanding, diplomatic and strategic, as a way of furthering diplomatic and strategic goals. The United States, for a long time, was simply absent. I mean, under the Trump administration, there was a prohibition on exporting, PPE. As a result, USAID was providing ventilators, which is not to say that ventilators weren't needed in the region, but, the perception was the Chinese are here helping us facilitate this stuff, and appearing on the tarmac every time a plane arrived, with a shipment of masks. Right. And the United States was saying, America first. Biden has been saying the same thing on vaccines. There's certainly a political logic to that, but the Biden administration has also donated or committed $4 billion to the COVAX international vaccine facility to make vaccines available to lower income countries. So yeah, there's been a lot of strategic competition and the US has not come out ahead at all.
Thanks for that. And that was a question that I had, but also that was sent in by one of our viewers. We only have a couple of minutes left, and it almost symbolically, it sort of mirrors the amount of attention Americans often fail to pay to the Caribbean. But I have the sense that the Caribbean is suffering terribly, even in the context of a Western Hemisphere recession of some severity. These tourism-dependent economies in the Caribbean, it seems to me, have been devastated by this. Do you see a way forward for them? And do you see anything that the United States can do in the near and midterm to help these economies recover?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I mean, the Caribbean, to a lesser extent, Mexico, I mean, the economies that have a, heavy part of their GDP tied up with the tourism industry have just been whacked. I mean, it's just been really, really tough. Now, one way, and we're about to publish something on this soon, hopefully within the week, one way that the United States could help enormously is by taking this notion of reshoring, bringing productive capacity, manufacturing capacity from China back to the United States and transforming that into nearshoring and looking at the entire Caribbean basin, Caribbean countries, Central American countries, even the northern part of South America, Colombia, and, God willing, at some point, Venezuela, could really benefit from a much more ambitious and creative sort of conception of this area as the U.S. near abroad, as the Russians like to think of their, the former Soviet republics, and think of the way they're messing around in Venezuela as having a presence in the U.S. near abroad. If we could think of this kind of these contiguous areas as a broader economic zone, there a lot could happen. But I'm not sure that politicians in the U.S. have the imagination, to make that happen.
Ooh, you may be right. Well, a final question, and we only have a couple of minutes. The role of the inter-American system, it seems to me, is or has been not much discussed in the context of the pandemic, and I'm a little puzzled as to why not. But do you see that either the OAS or PAHO has played a particularly helpful role in the pandemic to this point?
Well, I think the answer is that PAHO certainly has. The Pan American Health Organization is part of the World Health Organization, but kind of predates it in a lot of ways. So has this kind of semi-autonomous status. And I think that they've been tremendously helpful. They have a lot of expertise, have advised governments. They don't necessarily have a lot of resources to distribute. Another example of where under the previous US administration, we were, freezing the budget of PAHO, and it suffered at the same time that the US withdrew from the World Health Organization. Some of that funding was put back in by Congress. Key role. It is, an organization of governments,
Right.
so that in a lot of ways it's only as good as its member states want it to be. The same is true of the OAS. I'm not sure that the OAS has played much of a role, but it has played, I think, a helpful role in bringing attention to this ongoing crisis of Venezuelan refugees. But it's a very polarized body, and reflects, for better or for worse, all the divisions that exist in the hemisphere. So its capacity to really be a neutral arbiter, of some of the deeper conflicts, I think, is limited.
Cynthia Arnson, you've been terrific. And I've actually been getting comments from some of our viewers who are so very appreciative of your remarks today. So thank you for joining us. If other questions come in after we conclude our session today, I'll pass them along to you. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being with us. And we hope to see you again soon.
Great.
Cindy, thank you
so much for the invitation.
Oh, it was great.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Stay safe, everybody.